So, hello everyone, and I'm just going to bring up Mark and bring up the two Marks, who should hopefully be as one of them, and we should have a second Mark coming to join us very shortly. Mark Eschenberg should be his feed coming up now as well. So, just whilst we're waiting, there we are. There's Mark there. Hi, Mark.
Hey, Dan. Hi, Mark.
Hey.
So, I tell you what, I was going to ask a question, but I'll leave it to the experts. So I'll leave it to you guys. So we'll be bringing up others shortly to join the discussion. But really interested to hear how you both felt that went. And as I said, we'll bring up others shortly. So over to you both. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Are you able to hear me okay, Mark?
Loud and clear, Mark.
Excellent. That's better than some of the last session then.
Yes.
As someone who had the benefit of being able to listen to all of the session, perhaps we could start by asking for some of your takeaways from that panel.
I thought it was absolutely fascinating session. I mean, you covered a lot of ground in your discussion already. Maybe I'll just bring a few thoughts from the audience, because it was a very lively chat in parallel to the discussion, which is always the sign of some good speakers. And it's also the sign that there's something interesting that speakers are saying. So we just 2-3 takeaways, and then I see we have many people queuing up already to say something. So I won't take much of the screen time. But I think the first point was that as much of course the session is about 5G, there was a general kind of suggestion to not just focus on 5G, but to have a broader look into telecoms infrastructure to make sure that the framework for telecom infrastructure is there. You know, for example, backhaul, because like a 5G access is only as good as the backhaul that it's on, as an example. So that's, I think, a very important point to always keep in mind if you do have a 5G discussion. There was also a suggestion to keep thinking about sharing and increased sharing as networks become denser. And the question here was both about, can regulation do something, and how can we make it easier for operators to achieve such sharing? Which again, I think is critical in a time where you go into dense networks. And quite frequently there was a call for data regulation, which you quite nicely saw on the poll results that you mentioned as well, to make sure that regulation helps as much as possible to bring this forward. Although maybe on a slightly downward side, there was a feeling that maybe 5G is a little bit too late to help with this crisis. I think a point that you also discussed with your panelists. But I think it's going to be very important to take, as Philip Marnick as well said, to take what we see now and try to learn from that and put it into a better future infrastructure. So I think that's a bit of a very short summary of what was going on in parallel to when you were discussing.
Thank you, Mark. And yes, I agree. I mean, in the short term, there's the current pandemic, but in the not much longer term, there may well be recurrences of COVID-19 that will be important to be as prepared for as possible.
Indeed.
And in the future, a longer term one might well expect that other pandemics may be around the corner.
Let's hope not. Let's hope not.
An optimistic start to the session. With that, perhaps we can get the reaction from our first guest. So, as I introduce each of you, perhaps you could start by just stating your name and your organization so that everybody in the audience is aware, even if Mark or I know you. And then if you could perhaps try and keep at least initial contributions to 1 or 2 minutes. That way we can hear from as many people as possible, and we may be able to interact on the comments that you make rather than just passing on to the next person. So first up, Jaume, if I've pronounced that in any way correctly.
Quite well, thank you. I like the conversation about infrastructure for sure, and sharing and so on. So I would like to pick on that. So first of all, hi everyone, good afternoon to everyone, and thanks Dan and Forum Europe and Marx to the great panel and to put together all these sessions that are really interesting. Also, I want to wish a safe containment to everyone. So yeah, hard times, but together we can do it. So I'm Jaume Pujol, the head of regulation at Cellnex Telecom, but this afternoon I will speak on behalf of EWIA, the European Wireless Infrastructure Association. EWIA represents the European Independent Wireless Infrastructure Operators, independent meaning non-controlled by MNOs or not a JV with MNOs. Our figures at double 10, we are 10 members in 10 different countries, and operating within on the countries most impacted by the COVID, for instance, Italy, Spain, and France. Regarding the panel before, I was especially interested by some of the panel thoughts and mainly the reference made for the 5G rollout, the need for bringing the connectivity in general as a way to help on the economic recovery, and also about the discussions about the 5G coverage and service and so on. It was really, really interesting. It's an interesting and tricky question and an issue to be solved for sure in the future. But anyhow, no matter which technology are you speaking about, for sure you will need some infrastructures there. And I think that independent tower costs can definitely play a role for this. So I would like to share with you a few elements from the point of view of the independent tower costs. So to keep delivering the 5G on track, we see three main challenges in Europe. One, more towers. Two, the need for a fast rollout. And three, need for more capital. Frankly speaking, even we are in a big crisis, probably those three key aspects or key strategic things remain the same. So those challenges, independent tower costs, which are represented here, we can bring. Regarding more towers, well, we have a massive wireless infrastructure. We have 70,000 assets in Europe, and new ones are being built and acquired daily. Regarding the rollout, well, we have a quick and an open access over the neutral host model. And regarding the capital, well, our capacity to bring significant investment and raise additional capital to the telecoms ecosystem. So because the economic context due to the COVID and so on, and agreeing with Andreas' thoughts made during the session, let me further explore a little bit on this last point about the capital. I mean, it has been assessed that the largest outsourcing to independent tower costs in Europe, for instance, let's imagine a reach of 50%, could bring up to 28 billion, said again, 28 billion of financing to roll out of 5G, 4G coverage extensions. So I think it's a quite significant amount of money. In addition, it's significant, and it's not just words. I mean, one of the few major economic deals happened during this COVID period came actually from our sector, with our members. One which I know quite well, for instance, acquiring sites in Portugal. So even during the lockdown, even in that times, big capex money is flowing from tower costs to MNOs, helping the rollout of towers. So in conclusion, we think that independent wireless infrastructure model, which is growing but still much less developed in Europe than in the rest of the world, has a great potential for keeping the delivering of 5G on track. We are participating in the construction of this European digital society in Europe, but we do think that we can help more. So let's make it happen together. Thanks.
Perfect. Mark, I'll just take over here for a second because you seem to have been cursed today with your connection. Thanks so much, Jaume. If it's okay, I may just take the next contribution already and see whether there's anything to discuss. I think next up is Thorsten Küpper. Word is over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Thorsten from Qualcomm, and thanks for the initial statements, and of course to the panelists for this inspiring panel. What we have learned from the panelists was that I think we are all in agreement that connectivity, 5G, is super important during the crisis to lift the burden, but it will act as a kind of a vitalization program as well after the crisis, if everything goes well. And if we see the impact on COVID from the global perspective, you can already see that maybe the COVID crisis has not such a negative impact on the 5G rollout. So if you see, for instance, to the US, which is a little bit ahead of pace, deployment of 5G continues in a good speed. If you look at China, where the crisis at first occurred, you see already that in March, 30% of the smartphones sold are 5G smartphones, coming from less than 20% in December. So you see the demand is there and 5G is growing. But we have to be careful in this regard that we in Europe do not fall behind, because we see it must be a vitalization program. It must help after the crisis. And what concerns me a little bit, if we consider or if we discuss a delay, for instance, of a spectrum auction in France, in Austria, in Spain, in Poland, and so on and so far. So I see this a little bit as a risk currently, as well as the rollout of millimeter wave. And so we heard from Philips that in the UK, they already had some good experiences in this regard. In the US, they are ahead of the rollout of millimeter wave as well. Yesterday, Singapore announced that they will roll out millimeter wave, as well as Japan and Korea already. So, and I see that this space in Europe is a little bit behind, if you see it from an international perspective. So having said all this, I see, of course, the potential of 5G, of the 5G rollout for Europe. It's definitely there, and it will be our future. But we really have to act smart, especially under the impression of this crisis. And this means that we, of course, need smart funding programs, that we have to fight against the shortfall of capital in the operators, right? For instance, by coming up with smart regulations. So a lot of opportunities, but from an international perspective, and if we consider international competition, we have to act smart. Yeah. The first statement.
Perfect. Thanks, Thorsten. An interesting statement. One point that I wonder in this context, when Europe is clearly not much has yet happened in Europe on millimeter when it comes to rollouts, but of course Europe is very much probably not necessarily ahead of the curve, but very much going strong when it comes to 3.5 gigahertz, which is probably one of the reasons that the US has so much pushed on millimeter wave. So I'm wondering if maybe it's not an issue to be behind a millimeter wave as long as you can keep the momentum on 3.5 going. Not knowing that you shouldn't forget about it.
Yeah, frankly speaking, of course, most of the launches are generally globally are below 6 gigahertz, right? So it's in the spectrum below 6 gigahertz. And in this regard, we are doing well. But I think that 5G can raise its full potential only in the interplay of all frequency bands. Yeah, Andreas mentions this for the 700 megahertz. I fully agree on this. And we see it in the Netherlands.
Oh.
I didn't do it.
What did you do, Mark?
I don't know.
Today's speaker's curse.
Depends on where Thorsten is. I mean, from my perspective, it never rains, it pours. But this one wasn't a platform issue. This was the spectacular thunder and lightning outside my house that seems to have knocked over our fiber connection. The good news is I'm now connected via tethered 4G. So it's a good advert for both mobile connectivity and resilience in networks, I think.
Yes, indeed, another village.
Perhaps we can move on to hear from Jonas Wessel.
Indeed.
Thank you very much, Mark. Well, of course, I mean, I'm Jonas Wessel, director of at the PTS, the Swedish regulator, and of course I'm running this over Wi-Fi, over LTE. Been following the whole conference this way just to prove that mobile actually works. First of all, just to turn to Forum Europe and Dan and the team arranging this, because I mean we're coming a bit towards the end of a conference, and I think that one of the major takeaways, really, both from this sessions and the others, is that international work matters, because all of a sudden we've, from our very national bubbles, looked into the international scene. And in this conference, we have participants from all over the world, which is unusual at these conferences. I'm really, really happy to hear from all of the world in this. Other takeaways, both from this session and others, is that actually networks are coping in general. We see that the mobile networks are coping. We have, over this session and others, been talking about two ends of the stick. One is the very rural areas where you don't have coverage, i.e. where you can't get connected in times where physical and social distancing is needed. The other one is indoors, where we're all confined into our living rooms and our bedrooms, and I don't know where everyone is sitting. So it's really about those two ends of the stick where 5G really might matter at the moment. And also, since spectrum and connectivity is the enabler of sort of physical distancing, which we can see as we work, I think that most of you saw or read today the quote from the Microsoft CEO, who said that we've had 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months. And I think that's true. And we need to sort of take that on board and see what will happen in the 2 months to come. What can we learn from that? What are the takeaways? And I think that one of the takeaways is really that we've had in these sessions and others heard, let's say, the usual suspects saying the usual things, that you need more spectrum for this and that. And guess what? you're all right. It is exactly what we need. We need more spectrum for everything. It is not for this and that. It's not for Wi-Fi, not for 5G, etc. We need more spectrum for everything, and we need to work spectrum harder. So that's really giving industry, regulators, politicians, etc. Sort of a heads up, A+. We've been doing all right, but not good enough. And we're seeing now that we need to sort of take the next step. So I have 4 very simple takeaways for all our governments and regulators out there. Make spectrum available, both license exempt and licensed, but make it available now because it's needed. Secondly, remove restrictions. We've seen in a number of countries where you've gone to service and technology neutrality to enable the transformation from 3G to 4G to 5G type services. Remove those obstacles in your licenses now. Also have timely auctions. We've had many discussions on postponing and pushing auctions and awards in general into the future. I believe that is dead wrong. The value of spectrum is not what is delivered on the paycheck in upfront auction. It is the value that is created in society by operators to users and the market in general. And fourth point on that agenda is to keep those awards simple. I think we heard quite a lot in the session yesterday that this is not the time to make complicated, best sort of theoretical auctions, multi-band, multi this and that. Just get the spectrum out there to sort of answer to the demand that is flourishing in the market. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. And I think your point about digital transformation, having had 2 years worth of advancement in 2 months, is spot on. And perhaps
Well, it wasn't my point. It was actually
for the purposes of this panel. But I think maybe it points us as well towards the fact that, unfortunate though it's been, the current health crisis perhaps shines a light on what could be done with the assistance of the telecoms industry to meet one of the other great crises that we're facing at the moment, which is, of course, the environment, climate change. And this conference demonstrates quite aptly what can be done without having to rack up nearly as many air miles. Perhaps, Torsten, you were cut off in mid-flow before. Perhaps if we just finish hearing from you and then we can move on to Simon.
Yeah, just to finish my thought. So it was about that I think that 5G can raise its full potential only in the interplay of all spectrum bands, 700 megahertz, sub-6, as well as millimeter wave. And I couldn't agree more with what Jonas just said. So all spectrum needs to be available and we have to put it onto the market. And this is a slight risk I see, which can somehow spoil a little bit the party if we now see the risk of delays in spectrum auctions throughout Europe. Because this can really be a big disadvantage for our whole ecosystem and for the development, especially if we take into consideration that after COVID, well, the dice will be rolled again, yeah, as well as an international competition, and therefore we need to do our homework here in Europe. We have to get the spectrum out to enable the ecosystem to work with it. Yeah, and this is what I would advise, so to say.
That makes sense. I think just comparing the points being made here about the need to get spectrum out immediately with what Nick Blades from Telefonica was saying yesterday. I don't know if either of you were part of that session, but that actually a short delay, talking 6 months or so, might be quite necessary in order to, for logistical reasons as much as anything else. But that, in my view, anyway, that probably wouldn't have a major impact on delaying rollout in the medium term. Do you think that a delay of that sort of nature is acceptable? Or are you advocating that we really need to push ahead even within the next 6 months?
I mean, just if I can come in on that, in reply to Nick's comment yesterday, I fully agree with that. But to one degree, that was really a comment on very complex auctions.
Agreed.
It might actually be to take one band at a time. Do not do the whole sort of big band multi thingy, because that requires people to get together. That requires that. If you have simpler auctions, you don't need that logistical problems.
Yes, fair enough.
Good. Shall we take Simon's contribution as well?
Thank you. I was quite pleased with the responses to my questions. They did give quite a good, from Philip and from Andreas, a quite good rationale for why 5G can help bring us out of the recession, which is probably going to be quite a few years anyway. But the thing that struck me is that they're talking about a different type of network architecture, specialist terminals, and Torsten was talking about the US and the millimeter waves, but that's also a different ecosystem, largely built around fixed wireless access. And I therefore wonder if what we're seeing is the ecosystem for 5G going off in different directions, which are not precursors to the wider rollout of 5G for consumers. And I also made a comment on the chat that the benefit of 5G over 4G is probably one of the places where that is least is in the rural areas, because of the lower frequencies not enabling massive MIMO and the lack of reflections as well. So I think there's an interesting question about whether we're seeing actually 5G going off in a different direction, which might not be the successor to 4G, but something quite different. Thank you.
This is an interesting time because I think it ties into a point that was also raised in the chat whilst you were talking, which is whether, and I think it's a problem we've had at previous conferences, the question of what is 5G. I think people talk about 5G, and maybe people talking about 5G may mean three different things. So I think you have a very valid point when it comes to the fact that just 700 megahertz alone won't change the issue of the digital divide that also Amit was mentioning earlier on. You need different solutions there, and maybe you need to repurpose some of the bands to make backhauling more simpler, because of course getting into rural areas is prohibitively expensive. But that maybe can be different to the 5G that for example Mohammed from Huawei talked about when he was really talking about localized solutions. So I think I haven't yet heard the answer of how exactly you close the digital divide in rural areas with the solutions we have at present. But I think probably that's where Jaume would probably argue that they have good infrastructure to at least make the networks denser and kind of get more out there in a more affordable fashion, to bring you back into the discussion.
Well, sorry, because I lost a little bit of the conversation because I dropped off. But anyway, for sure, digital divide is one issue that needs to be tackled. But one way of doing is sharing infrastructure. I mean, it's easier to deploy one infrastructure and share it among different MNOs than to deploy 3-4 infrastructure. That's clear. So that makes us to think that our model makes sense and can help Europe on reaching and trying to tackle this digital divide.
So I guess one question is, you say what is 5G? And I think there's been a sort of tacit assumption in a lot of the discussions that 5G equals new radio. And that's the difference between 4G. When we're talking about 4G and 5G, we're talking about difference between LTE and new radio. And is actually the difference of 5G not so much on the radio interface, but in what sits behind it, the core architecture, the platforms, the applications, and particularly for that wide area consumer focusing network.
Guys, I'm sorry to have to jump in here, and I'm sure we could continue this conversation for a long time, but I think we're actually running a little bit behind schedule, so we are going to have to draw things to a close. So I'd like to say a big thank you to all of our members of the audience who come up and have contributed in the discussion there. So thank you so much to all of those, and thank you as well to the two Marks. It's kind of like the new Spectrum duo, the comedy act, the two Marks. It's could go into it. So guys, thank you so much. Just to ask both of you, do either of you have any final comments or final points you want to make before we wrap up?
Mark, go ahead.
I have flashbacks to joint projects in 2010 when there was a Mark on the client side as well. No, to be honest, I think it was an absolutely fantastic session. I think I wrapped up. I mentioned some of the thoughts that I found very inspiring from the chat at the start of this session. The one thing that concerns me is that I think, and this is maybe a bit esoteric, but humans have the tendency to forget things after a short period of time. So, as much as I don't hope that COVID-19 is a very persistent struggle we have to face, in the same way, I hope that we don't forget all the things we discussed right now, and in 1 or 2 years' time, kind of rack up our air miles again. Don't worry too much about all the points we've discussed right now. I think there's a tendency to forget what has happened if it goes away. So hopefully we can take all these valid points of inspiration we've heard over the last few days, and in particular the point and what can we learn from this and do better in the future, and make sure that doesn't get forgotten and actually helps improve our networks to be more resilient in the future. And not just for a medical crisis, but for, because we talk about crisis, but not every crisis is necessarily a pandemic of the sort we're facing right now. But to be more resilient for whatever crisis come our way, and use the telecoms network hopefully in a similarly efficient way to what we've done over the last months.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. And Mark C, and any final thoughts from your side?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I'd echo those thoughts. I think the power of connectivity is something that's been illustrated a lot through the crisis and through this conference. And there are questions of policy around that related to digital divide and timings of auctions and so on and so forth. But ultimately, I think everybody's kind of on the same page here, which is that we want to expand connectivity and services as quickly and as reliably as possible. And everybody really is probably pushing in the same direction to try and put the policy in place that allows us to do that.
Brilliant. Guys, look, thank you both so much. Really, really appreciate that. And once again, thank you to all of our speakers and panelists today, and of course from yesterday and Tuesday as well. So I think hopefully you'll agree we've had some really, really interesting discussions. And I think as Jonas mentioned, it's been great to have so many different views from you in the audience and from so many different parts all around the world. So I think, yeah, it has been great. And we really do appreciate all of your participation, all your involvement as well. So thank you. So we're not quite finished. We do have 30 minutes or so left, or 20 minutes now, 25 minutes for networking and to visit the exhibition area. So please do make use of the networking platform that we have and go and visit the exhibition stands. I think some of the exhibitors are again going to be live and having some live chats in their stands. So please do go and check those out. For those of you who've been invited to the private bilateral meetings, those will now also be starting. That will be taking place in the sessions tab, so you can access that from the sessions tab. You'll be able to see the meeting room if you are taking part in one of those. And finally, yeah, just maybe to end up with another couple of thank yous from my side. First of all, again, to all of our sponsors and partners, we really do appreciate all of your support of the event, and yeah, do appreciate you basically making this event possible. So thank you very much to all of you, and a huge thank you from me, a personal thank you from me to all of our team here at Forum Europe, our team who've been working very hard behind the scenes to get everything working with this event. So really appreciate, guys, everything that you've been doing. I think we've had about half the team involved in this. It's definitely a lot more effort involved in organising a virtual event than there is in a place. So guys, well done, and particularly to James, Luna and Jordan and the Spectrum team who've done a fantastic job putting everything together. So thank you, guys. So that's about it. Just one thing to mention about our physical Global Spectrum Series events. We do have 6 regional events that are still scheduled to take place before the end of this year. We are going to be obviously looking over the course of the next few weeks exactly what we're going to be doing with those. There's a lot of uncertainty around at the moment, but we are committed to holding all of those events in some format before the end of the year, and we'll definitely keep you all updated with the plans in that area. So that said, thank you all so much again for your participation. Please do go and make use of the networking area, the exhibition area, and we hope to see you all again very soon. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Brilliant.